Hi, this is Leslie Terebesi again, and the purpose of this video is to introduce my latest book to the readers through my YouTube channel. And this book was just published on Amazon in paperback format. And the title of the book is Tradition as Judgment in Islam. So I want to keep this video under 15 minutes. So for the details, of course, the reader is advised to look into the description below the video, and also, of course, the book. An abridged version of the book will be available on the academic websites, Academia and ResearchGate, with a link to the Amazon page. So perhaps I can begin by saying how this book came about. Actually, this book arose, as almost every book I have recently completed, out of a certain concern with a particular question. And initially, I had intended to write a short piece, say 4 or 5 pages, something like a viewpoint. But once I started writing it, I don't know what I should say, I couldn't stop. It was more like ideas kept coming, so I kept writing. And next thing I knew, I had a text basically the size of a paper. And then, since the idea still kept coming, I kept writing. And eventually, I ended up with a text of about 20,000 words in length, together with various quotations to support my case. Perhaps I can mention a few names as to the authors that I relied on, so the reader or the viewer may get a better idea where I'm coming from. I'm a Muslim revert. I have been a Muslim since 1992, from Canada, but tracing my roots back to Eastern Europe, who has been living for an extended period of time in Malaysia. So, after working in the private sector, teaching various subjects at the matriculation level, I joined an Islamic university here in Malaysia, where I worked as an academic staff, a lecturer, a coordinator of the English program, a writer. I did a bit of research and writing and published a little bit, and that lasted about 5 years. After that, I joined the International Institute of Advanced Islamic Studies, here also in Malaysia, where I worked as editor, and I also began to write stuff, beginning with some book reviews and eventually longer pieces. So, after leaving the institute, I was still left with some unanswered questions, and among them was one that figured prominently was the question of abrogation. I always had difficulty with that, and I sort of wrote some text on it, which has been published. Some of it is published on Amazon in the form of a book called "Does the Final Testament Abrogate the New and the Old and the New Testaments?" And there's some papers also on Academia and ResearchGate addressing this issue of abrogation. Perhaps I could add that the I have developed some additional ideas on the issue of abrogation, partly based on my reading of Muhammad Shahrur's book, which I highly recommend, by the way. The name of the book is Quran, Morality and Critical Reason. It was published in 2007, went through about 5 or 6 editions, and I may add it raised a fair bit of controversy because of the novelty of his ideas. But I found after reading the book that many of the ideas that is expressing in that book, I myself shared, and in fact arrived at, as it were, independently of reading his book. But I'm very happy that on some of these issues our ideas coincide. I can just give one example. He writes that the Quran does not really contain ambiguous passages, but rather the passages which are identified as ambiguous have been identified as such partly through a reading that was not as careful perhaps as it should have been. And actually he has, I think, about 6 errors that he identifies in the book. that the exegetes, in his view, made when interpreting the Quran, and on the basis of which they arrived at the conclusion that the Sunnah or the Hadith, Al Shafi made the two equal, and I will use the term interchangeably here, although of course the case can be made and has been made that the two terms should not be conflated, but rather should be considered as separate terms. But anyway, Shahrur came to the conclusion that basing Islamic law on the basis of the Sunnah or the Hadith, or what we know as prophetic traditions, is problematic. And I pretty much share that view with him. And perhaps I can go into the reasons why as part of this introduction. But before doing that, let me mention two or three other sources that I have relied on fairly extensively in this text. One of them is Taha Jabir Alwani's work, specifically his book called Reviving the Balance, which was published in 2017 by Triple IT in the United States. And also, there are some writings on abrogation which are worth looking at by the same person. I have also relied on the work of Mohammed Ghazali, the Egyptian sheikh, who also rejected the doctrine of abrogation. And in addition to that, I have some quotations from the from the work of Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman, whose book called Crisis in the Muslim Mind, I also highly recommend. And there's another book that is very worth reading, published in 2011, and it's called Retrieving the Quranic Worldview, I believe. After these three or four sources, of course, I recommend the work of Muhammad Asad, his commentaries on the Quran, he contained in the footnotes to his translation of the Quran, and perhaps one other source I can mention that is worth looking at is Daniel Brown's book on tradition. I think the book is called Rethinking Tradition. So now coming to the main question, why have I or what are the reasons for doubting that tradition or the hadith or the sunnah should be used as a foundation for Islamic legislation? First of all, the Quran makes it clear that judgment belongs to Allah, that only He has the right to legislate between right and wrong. In other words, our source of judgment in matters of religion should be based on revelation, the revelation of the Quran. Now, that doesn't mean that we cannot legislate, additional laws, for example, traffic laws and what have you. Of course, we can do that, and the previous, generations have done that as well. The Jews have legislated something for themselves, the Bani Israel, which Allah did not prescribe for them, and also the Christians have legislated something for themselves that were not prescribed by Allah to Allah. And Jesus, peace be on him, is presented in the Quran as having come partly to make for the Bani Israel halal what was previously made haram for them. So there are some cases where people are permitted to legislate, but these are matters of not really matters of so much matters of religion, but rather perhaps how do I put this? Matters of an administrative nature, for one, and also matters which do not directly affect the principles of religion. Let me leave it at that for the time being. But so, having noted that legislation, especially criminal legislation, criminal law, should be based on revelation, what we notice that about 95% of the Sharia is actually based on the traditions of the Prophet, peace be on him. And then we have to recall that the Sunnah or the Hadith, contrary to the mainstream position on this issue, is not revelation. The mainstream position is that there are two types of revelation. The manifest revelation, Wahi Zahir, as the proponents of this view put it, and the second revelation, the Sunnah or the Hadith, which the proponents of this dual notion of revelation call Wahi Batin. But if we look into the Quran, we notice that the Quran does not make any reference to any secondary kind of revelation. The only revelation that the Quran refers to is the revelation of itself, the Quran, and the previous revelations, the ones that were sent to the previous prophets and also to the Bani Israel and to the people that call themselves Christians. So now, since law has to be based on revelation, and since tradition is not revelation, therefore, how can we possibly base legislation on tradition? That is the question. So the short answer is that we should not be doing that. And we can see the effects of doing it in two aberrations that resulted from legislating on the basis of tradition in preference to revelation. And the two examples I want to give are the legislation on adultery and the legislation on apostasy. In both of these cases, the legislation for these two alleged crimes, for these transgressions, the punishments for these transgressions are in both cases based on man-made tradition, in other words, on human reports of an uncertain nature, in preference to, and perhaps I could say even in defiance of the teaching of revelation on the subject. Because, as we know, the Quran does not prescribe any punishment for apostasy in this life. Any punishment for apostasy comes in the hereafter. Yet the tradition prescribes the death penalty for apostates, which is a direct violation of contradiction, a violation, if you like, or defiance of the teaching of revelation of the Quran on the subject. So how could this have happened? How could the hadith on apostasy, which is a solitary hadith narrated by a single chain of narrators, how could the words of human being overrule the words of Allah? That is a good question, and many people are asking it, including Taha Jabir Alwani and Mohammed Shahrur. And of course, I have also expressed reservations about this reversal of the authority of the man-made tradition and the revelation of the Quran. The second example is that of adultery. The Quran prescribes the punishment of 100 lashes for adulterers convicted of this crime based on the testimony of 4 reliable witnesses. But the man-made tradition, the hadith, prescribed the death penalty, capital punishment by stoning to death. So once again, we see here an example where man-made traditions effectively overruled the revealed word of God. How did this happen? How could this have happened? Because clearly here we have a case of human beings overruling the words of Allah. Now, who is the highest authority in Islam? Obviously, it is Allah. It is not the narrators of the traditions, but it seems to me that in these two cases, the traditions were permitted to overrule the word of God, and the legislation based on his man-made tradition was effectively made to be a part of Islamic law. Now, don't you think this is a problem? I think it is a huge problem. So I think what we need to do, as Taha Jabir Alwani pointed out in his book, we need to find a methodology by which we can subordinate all tradition to revelation and restore the proper ranking of the sources of the Sharia, which actually, in traditional terms, places the Quran in the uppermost position. According to the Shafi doctrine, the Quran should be the first source of the law, followed by the Sunnah, the second source, and then only followed by the work of the scholars, and finally followed by the work of individual jurists. So I think I will leave it at this for the time being. The viewers may find additional details in the video description below, and of course also in the book itself, which is currently available on Amazon. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.